Okay, warm welcome to everyone who's joined us today, particularly from Europe and North America and potentially South American registrants as well. This is our monthly webinar tied to our monthly thematics. And as it says on your screens, and I guess you've seen in your inbox, today we're talking about the Insurance Digital Health Innovation Index, first of its kind, where we have undertaken an analysis of what insurance is truly doing in digital health. We are at the half hour just gone. People are slowly joining us, but we'll start slowly because that'll enable people to catch up. My name is Julian Salaberry. I'm the CEO and the founder of Galen Growth. Galen Growth, for those who don't know us very well, is a multinational company that's now built the world's leading digital health private market data, intel and insights platform for industry and for investors as well as for startups. We have over the years essentially built a platform that has more data than anyone else when it comes to digital health. A best-in-class taxonomy, which enables us to really get into the detail of digital health. And of course, the platform has better search results than even Google. So you can imagine the hours you'd save yourself using HealthTech Alpha versus any other platform, including your friend Google. It's also the platform and the data that powers our thematic reports, somewhat unequaled thematic reports, largely because of the breadth and the depth we get to, rather than just running around talking about funding. If you want to know more, please visit our research page at Galen Growth/research, where you'll see the full index of all our research. And as you'll find, most of it is complimentary. Please click and join us by downloading one of or many of our reports. So, as I said, today's focus is our first of a kind analysis of how insurers are measuring up in adopting digital health, as it is literally rewriting the healthcare value chain and patient expectations, or in the case of an insurer, policyholders' expectation. It's a report that is 40 plus pages of data and insights, and it is totally free to download. The scope is digital health, which is in accordance with our taxonomy, which can be found on HealthTech Alpha, which is our platform, which you can use free of charge by just creating your own basic account. We look at ventures that have been incorporated, and we look at ventures from 2002 up until now, all the way through their life cycle to the point where they exit either through an acquisition or through an SPAC or even an IPO. We are today looking more specifically at those that have a relationship with an insurer. And my colleague Sarah, who heads up our research and analytics for Europe and the US, or more specifically North America, will help us as a quick look at the methodology as we go forward with this. In terms of quick husbandry of this call, please feel free to ask questions. I would strongly recommend that you use the Q&A. You can raise your hand if you want, or you can use the chat if you want, but there is a risk that we miss it. And so the Q&A helps not only us see your question and reply to it, but also, I guess, some of your fellow registrants to be able to like it too and move it up the pecking order of questions to be answered. So let's start. Sarah, welcome. Thank you very much once again for joining us on this webinar and bringing to life through voice a report that's now been available for 2 or 3 weeks on our website, which has been much downloaded. But we thought we would bring some light to it by bringing in a bit more of our own interpretation of some of the data. And as we usually do, we'll run a format where essentially I'm going to ask you some questions that relate to the report and leave you to answer in voice, but also using slides. And hopefully we'll get some questions from our audience as well. So listen, in November 2021, Sarah, we looked at Pharma's Digital Health Innovation Index, which again was another first of its kind analysis, where we looked, of course, at how pharmaceutical companies were really measuring up when it came to digital health. There's been a lot of hype in that space. But let's not dwell on that one, because I know we'll be updating it in a month or two. Let's really look at the insurers. And as we've been saying for a little while, digital health is at least 10 years old now. So it's high time, really, we started looking at how some of these large incumbents, such as insurers, are actually doing in digital health, as they are really a key stakeholder in the space. We know, all of us on this call, all of us in digital health or engaged in digital health, know that healthcare inflation is not slowing down. And inflation is really the topic of the last few weeks on all fronts, and not just healthcare costs, but other costs. Certainly, inflation has been felt lately in a lot of countries, and of course North America, as we know, more specifically the US, as we know. Healthcare cost is now about 20% of GDP, so it's no small amount. So it's leaving the industry in a bit of a bind, with over half of these guys, according to a McKinsey study, not earning their cost of equity due to essentially their limited productivity improvements over the past few years, and an increasing fight to remain relevant to the policyholder, the customer, particularly in the life and the health insurance categories. So with that context, we feel at Gale and Growth, and we're not the only ones, but I'm just going to represent Gale and Growth today. We feel that insurers, or payors, depending on where you are in the world, are going to rethink their business model and, of course, their role in healthcare. The strategic imperative on the industry, among many others, is really to improve the customer experience or the policyholder experience, and to overcome their productivity stagnation, whilst really figuring out how to remain relevant to society. So it's a hell of a tall order. But we at Gale and Growth certainly believe that digital health brings an unprecedented opportunity for the industry to address many of those challenges. The advantage of using Health Tech Alpha, of course, means that we can drill down beyond the funding headline, which we all know too well. But frankly, a funding headline doesn't really tell us what the heck is going on in digital health, and therefore we do need to dig into it and see what's truly happening. So let's start with that. The analysis is looking at two verticals, where we try to understand what portfolio is being built by the insurance, thanks Sarah, and what the alignment to the strategy of that insurer is. Now, of course, it comes with a number of caveats, which is that we have a very good understanding of the portfolio of the insurer and a very good understanding of the makeup of that portfolio in terms of what's in it, but also what does it look like when we look at each venture. The caveat, of course, comes when we look at strategy, where, of course, we don't work for those organizations, and therefore we are needing to find a benchmark to try and have an equal comparison between each venture. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So this is the result of this inaugural assessment of insurers across the world. There's a reason why not every insurer on the planet is on this, and we'll come back to that. But it certainly gives you a very strong indication of who seems to have built a digital health set of relationships, more specifically partnerships, that are most aligned to the strategy of the insurer, or what we believe to be the appropriate strategy for that insurer, giving us that particular ranking. And very interesting to see the number of American insurers up there, very big names, Cigna, Humana, Kaiser Permanente, as well as, of course, a very large China insurer, Ping An. And we'll come back to that. So I guess my first question to you, Sarah, now that the people have had a chance to look at this and absorb it a bit more, is what is the significance of each of these quadrants? And what does it mean if you're Cigna or if you are, let's say, Sun Life, bottom right?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Thanks for inviting me today. So the analysis we did, as you said, really broke the bigger players into 4 quadrants. And you talked about before, we used 2 different scores, one being the strategy and one being the portfolio strength. So when you start looking at the different quadrants that you see here, with all the names scattered amongst within them, we'll start here. Let's start in what we call the nascent quadrant, right? The nascent quadrant are those insurers who are working with younger ventures. Right, that's their portfolio strength. Right, the portfolio strength says how strong are the ventures that you're working with, and within the nascent quadrant, they're working with younger, less experienced, ventures that have a less experienced, perhaps a less experienced executive team, right? There are advantages and disadvantages of working with younger compared to more mature ventures. The advantage that we typically see is your return on investment is much quicker with more mature ventures, right? And that's why we put at the lower end of the scale, right? The ventures that are less mature, there's going to be a lot more hands-on work. There a lot, perhaps a longer time to market for those solutions, and then the more mature ventures. Okay, as we move, as we just talked about, into the more mature ventures, so they're working with the right ventures, right? However, the strategy on the nascent and then the cautious quadrant, the strategy is at a much lower score, and that's because, and I'll go into the details a little bit of the strategy score and the portfolio strength in just a minute. But we're looking at they don't have as broad of a strategy. They're not rolling out digital health across their entire organization, across the globe, across all therapeutic areas, right? They're being more hesitant and perhaps adopting digital health in smaller portions before jumping in headfirst into this digital health world. So the nascent are the ones working with the younger ventures, being very cautious about about how much digital health they bring into their business. And then the cautious quadrant is really, they're working with good ventures, but they're just being much too cautious. They need to push ahead with rolling out digital health solutions. We'll jump up to the aspirational quadrant, which are then they're doing a great job. They're going for it, put digital health into solutions, into action wherever they can, right? However, they're working with the younger ventures, right? So they need to move forward with more mature ventures that can really help them get solution to market and get their return on investment much quicker and perhaps at a much larger scale. The optimal quadrant, I think, speaks for itself, right? They're working with more mature ventures and have rolled out digital health solutions on a much broader scale. So that's in general how we look at this particular 4x4 matrix of ventures and how we've mapped out the insurers that we looked at.
Thanks, Sarah. And before we jump into each of those axes to understand who's doing well on each respective axis, I touched on the methodology a little bit, or the scope of study a little bit. Do you want to just drilling a little bit more without spending too much time on, if we look at portfolio strength, what are typically some of the things we've looked at? And if we look at strategy score, what are typically some of the things we've looked at?
Definitely. And as you said before, this is a current snapshot, right, of the current portfolios that we know of these insurers. It's not looking forward. So looking forward, we hope that the insurers can take this information that we've put together and then do a critical evaluation of their own portfolios. So with this snapshot, we looked, the strategy score is really, as I mentioned before, how broadly is the insurer rolling out solutions across their organization. Looking at, are they focusing on a large number of therapeutic areas, right? Not only focusing on wellness solutions, preventive health, but also different therapeutic areas. And this is essentially looking at, are they covering the needs of as many clients as they possibly can, right? Are they broadly integrated across the patient journey, right? If you look in the report, the patient journey is described from wellness prevention to diagnosis through treatment, right? And then payment solutions, right? So this is the patient journey. Again, the insurer needs to be able to touch as many of their clients as possible, right? As many of their those enrolled in their insurance. And so looking at the number of therapeutic areas and the patient journey is really not only scratching the surface of that digital health, but really going deep into digital health. And finally, of course, that portfolio size, right? How many ventures are they working with across the globe? Excuse me, portfolio strength. The other axis that we looked at, we talked about is the maturity of the venture, looking at the strengths of the management team, their sorry, this is looking at the ventures themselves, right? Looking at the
Yeah, of course.
portfolio of that insurer, looking into the ventures and saying, do the ventures have strong management team, right? Do they have innovative products? Are they, do they have strong financial strength, right? Are they stable ventures and proven digital health maturity, right? So one is looking into the portfolio and the ventures that they're working with, and the other axis is looking at really the integration of the portfolio into their strategy.
So if we look at portfolio for a minute, I think you may have mentioned this, but just to reiterate, what was the threshold that defined a portfolio versus actually it's just a small number of relationships?
And here we looked at insurers that had, and then I can show you this a bit later on.
Okay.
But we looked at ventures that had more than 10 partnerships with ventures.
Or
Excuse me,
insurers
with
more than 10, yeah.
10
So
ventures.
linked to that, we got a question from someone called Matt, who you might know,
I
who
know.
has asked a classic that comes up from a lot of people, which is how are we distinguishing, I guess, CVC investments by an insurer's CVC versus the ones that are partnerships being built by the more operational side of the business? Have we merged them? Have we excluded them? And if so, why?
We've excluded the CVC investments. At the moment, we're just looking at the portfolio of venture solutions that they have, and not the investments that they've made. It's definitely another angle that could be brought into the analysis, perhaps for next year, Matt. But at the moment, we're only looking at the active ventures that they are partnering with.
Yeah, I would add as well, Matt, that often when we talk to CVCs, it's rare that actually their mandate is directly aligned to the operation strategy. They're much more IRR driven, and therefore we like to keep that distinguished separation, let's say, because then it allows us to really focus on partnerships being built by the operational side of the business because it's directly related to the operational strategy of the business. The second question we got here, which I will quickly address, and then we'll jump back into a question for you, then Sarah. Insurers who have done the report had not all reacted, but those who have, it has been one of curiosity and seeking greater understanding as to our methodology, but also to some extent how do they use data to make let's say, smarter decisions going forwards that allow those that, for example, not in the top right-hand quadrant to move to the top right-hand quadrant. Of course, this is not done overnight, so this is a conversation around what are some of the moves they need to consider and how should they look at digital health ecosystems in their respective geographies to actually be more strategically meaningful in their decisions. We are not really privy to talk about any conversations we've had with any insurers sitting in the cautious quad, but they'd be very few, to be honest. Thanks for that question. Sarah, so let's jump in then. Let's look at strategy if we can first, because I'm intrigued, and I'm sure everybody else is, as to who are the top performers and why do they generally do well.
Happy to answer that question. That's in the report you have, of course, the listing of the top 10, with Cigna ranking the first. Next coming Humana and AXA, tied for the second and third places. Cigna, if we look at their portfolio, right? Okay, Humana has the biggest portfolio. Cigna has 62 partnerships, as what we record, which is way beyond what most of their competitors are doing. So they're very active in partnering with digital health ventures, with a therapeutic depth of 28 therapeutic areas, right? So again, partnering with a lot of ventures and really going across that patient journey to touch as many conditions and as many specific touch points as they can, not just an overall solution that may or may not be really applicable for their clients. The patient journey is on the right-hand side, and they have for their strategy a distribution, right, of solutions across the prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and reimbursement journeys. Right, so it's a great distribution. They're trying to have as many touch points as they can and influence as much as they can, be a part of that journey. And their average alpha score for their portfolio is 70, which is really a maturity of 70 is saying that your average venture has already established products on the market and they're expanding into other areas, right? They're very mature ventures. And the average team score of 55 is also indicating that they're partnering with ventures with more mature, not the most mature, but relatively experienced and mature executive teams. So those ventures are very capable of participating in partnership and don't need a lot of hand-holding. The number of portfolios, and I think Julian will come back to this at a later point, we look at the clinical strength, right? Look at how many of those portfolio companies really have evidence that their solution works, right? And they have 10 companies within their portfolio. Of those 62 companies, 10 really have proof that their solutions do have, they work for the patients, right? They do have that evidence to show. So this is a great strategy score to have this type of number of partnerships, therapeutic depth, and distribution across the client journey. Now, if you go into the portfolio, you'll be looking more at the three items below, and I'll just jump into that, Julian, without being prompted. The top number, the number one portfolio strength was Kaiser Permanente. They scored 4th on the strategy ranking, but first in the portfolio strength, right? And that's where you come down here, the average alpha score is higher, average team score is higher, right? Although they don't have as many portfolio companies with clinical strength, but 7 out of 30 is actually a higher proportion than the 10 out of 60 that we saw with Cigna, right? Again, Kaiser also has a great distribution across the patient journey. So both Kaiser and Cigna are very strong ventures. I'll pop back up quickly to the 4x4, and you'll see here Kaiser, Cigna, and Humana pretty much reaching the top corner of the quadrant that you see. All right, so there's not a ton of difference between those three ventures or those three insurers, but the slight difference in numbers shows you why Kaiser's on top for portfolio and Cigna's on top for its strategy. Does that make sense?
Sorry, I was muted. It makes perfect sense, and we can explore that a little bit further on. But it's good to get a bearing, I guess, of how we look at those and give an example of Cigna and Kaiser Permanente in relation to getting a sense of who's scoring well. Obviously, it's predominance of North American investors doing well in this space, and some of it is due to the fact that they started early in this. I've got one question to come back to one of these players, but let's pursue this conversation a bit further. Essentially, insurers really have 3 ways to execute their digital health strategies: to build, to buy, or to partner. Pretty classic 3 strategic scenarios. As we know, certainly in Get and Grow from the corporate's track record so far, building digital health in-house, that's usually a low probability of success for many reasons. Some of them are well known. Buy tends to be an investment, but rarely has, or as I've said before, it's often not really got a direct connectivity or relativity to the core business. So really partnering tends to be the most effective way really to build, test, and transform the value chain and achieve a greater success rate. It's not foolproof, but it's a greater success rate versus some of the other options available to them. So with that context in mind, Sarah, what has been the insurer's appetite for partnerships for digital health to date?
The insurers have been quite eager to partner, and if we compare this actually to the pharma innovation index that we did, you saw a much higher spike in pharma. The big pharmas, all the way, the ones partnering had a ton of ventures, right? I think you had the top 20 had 80% of venturing. Whereas we're looking here into the insurance vertical, the insurance companies are much more distributed, right? With Humana having 56, I believe, 58 partnerships going down, and the slope here is it's still quite a steep slope, but it is more gradual than the pharma companies. So what we see is the top 28 insurers have 50% of the partnerships. So there's a very long tail that you see. There are many local insurers, smaller insurers that are dabbling in digital health. You can say they have maybe 1 or 2 partnerships, whereas the insurers that are very serious, those are the top 28 with 50% of the partnerships, right? And indeed, here is what we look at: 35 insurers have greater than or equal to 10 partnerships, and this was the focus here of our analysis. If you look on a global scale through all industry verticals, what we see is, although insurance is a very dominant vertical, insurance is actually captures only 4% of the partnerships. Or actually, what you see is all the partners for digital health ventures globally, only 4% of those partners are insurance companies. So you're looking actually at a very small slice of the pie as far as partners for digital health ventures.
Interesting. And I know when we started this analysis, we expected a Pareto rule of that ilk, largely because we've seen it in pharmaceuticals, for example, although I think it's more pronounced in pharma. But I was very surprised to see how few digital ventures have recorded or announced partnerships with insurers. There's an interesting question here from Michael that states that Cigna, as we know, removed Boy Health from its Evernorth digital health formulary, yet remains an investor. And the question is it a conflict or redirection being signaled by Cigna, I guess, and what do we believe? Michael, jury's out, I think, on that, because as we said earlier on, we seldom see a more than a fairly loose correlation between what the CVC is up to versus what the core business is doing. And so we were surprised to see Cigna core business step forward the way it did in relation to the formulary in view of its investment. It's too early, I think, to say whether there's a conflict there or not. So it's not particularly insightful answer to your question, but it's one that's certainly getting growth we're watching with interest, because I guess to the point you're making, there seems to be a misalignment between what core business is signaling versus what Cigna Ventures is signaling. Sarah, back to partnerships, but I just wanted to sort of address Michael's question because it was related to this. Our digital taxonomy is very often described as best in class. So if we use that as our lens and we look at where insurers have been focused to date, what does that tell us beyond, okay, they've got partnerships, but where we see them focus?
As we talked about before, we looked at the customer journey, right? That journey from prevention, wellness, through diagnosis, treatment, adherence, and then the reimbursement. And what you see, this heat maps that you see on the screen, is a very interesting trend. If you move all the way to the right-hand side, right, it's light color, so you're less likely to look at it. What's interesting are the insurers that only have 1 or 2 partnerships, right? What does it indicate? What's the critical partnerships that they have to have? And if you look across 30% of the insurers that only have 1 or 2 partnerships, 30% of those insurers have teleconsultation partnerships, right? So for me, this is a strong indication teleconsultation is critical, right, to have in the digital health portfolio if you're going to have a very, very small portfolio. Teleconsultation or some sort of digital health insurance channel, right, that online health insurance in 1 or 2 specific areas. right? These are the two critical areas, followed by disease management and corporate health with a much lower percentage, right? So that's really, if you're going to have one or two partnerships, that's where insurers tend to start. Now, when you move to the other end, right, where you have a full portfolio of digital health ventures, what this heat map is indicating is that treatment and adherence is going to build then the bulk of your portfolio, right? They have the insurers in with very large portfolios have almost 100% coverage as far as ventures within disease management, digital therapeutics, remote monitoring devices, and care coordination, right? They always have that in their portfolio. Followed by, of course, reimbursement solutions, and then as well, prevention, wellness apps, customer education, on-demand lab tests, and teleconsultation is also a part of that, right? So we go from the absolute minimum of what you have to have in your portfolio to, okay, having, if you can have as many as you want, they're really focusing on the treatment and adherence portion of the patient journey. So it's a very, very interesting look at what the makeup of these portfolios are.
It's fascinating in my view, and it shows how we're only really starting to see insurers really getting into the patient journey on an end-to-end basis over the recent past, which is encouraging, and so we're certainly not applauding it as such, but certainly we're pleased to see this, and we hope this momentum continues. So listen, we're slowly running out of time, and this was only really meant to be I guess a walk through, a snapshot of the 40 plus pages. But I didn't want to walk away without looking at not just, where these particular insurers are focusing, but I also want to get a sense of just how good are some of these ventures that they're focusing on. Because we all know that at the end of the day, not all ventures are born the same. And which is why we at Game Growth really like to drill in and dig in. And, not so long ago, there was quite a lot of, I guess, social media interest in a JMIR research paper on clinical robustness. There's an interesting white paper which set the tone for really the way in which digital health is being looked at by some more informed corners of the ecosystem, where it looked at a little over 200 ventures in the US and it set about trying to understand what their clinical robustness was. Of course, it made us smile here at Gale and Growth because, of course, we've been looking at clinical strength of a venture, but we've been looking at it across the globe. So essentially, our evaluation of the clinical strength of a digital health venture is based on what we've learned from looking at some 12,000 of them. So, for my last question, Sarah, and I'm sure there are many, many, many more, but for my last question is, if we look at the insurers and more specifically the digital health ventures they've actually partnered with, what does that clinical strength look like? And first of all, I guess, a quick touch on where we are defining clinical strength at a very high level. But more importantly, once you define that, what does that clinical strength look like if we look at what insurers have been building with digital health companies?
So we at Gale and Growth, as you mentioned, find it a critical piece of information, right? Because it's telling you whether a venture solution is actually scientifically sound and has had success, right, and has proven success. We consider within our clinical strength score if the venture has run clinical trials or if their devices have been used in clinical trials. We look at if they have regulatory filings. We don't look at FDA registrations, but really 510Ks. Any filing across the globe, other FDA filings that you might have. And then the third piece of our clinical strength, strength signal is then looking at peer-reviewed publications as a strong indication of their scientific or of their methodology, right? Whether or not they really have a solid methodology of going about a problem, looking at it scientifically and solving that problem. And so with the peer-reviewed publications, clinical trials and regulatory filings, you can get a strong indication of whether or not that venture has strong proof of their solution. So that's what we use. And what we found is that it probably quite intuitive. The most ventures that are partnering with insurers have clinical strength and treatment and adherence piece of the patient journey, right? That's pretty much common sense. This is the area where you need to have that clinical strength, right? And that evidence that your solution is working. And of course, looking then across the different categories, right, of different products that the ventures have put onto the market. The wearables, the ventures with wearable solutions have 56% of those ventures have clinical strength greater than 1, which means they either have 1 clinical trial, they have 1 regulatory filing, or they have at least 2 publications, right? Wearables, if they're going to be used for medical decisions, have to have some sort of regulatory approval. Digital therapeutics are the same way, right? Those 2 you don't, you expect to see on top of the list. Medical imaging, same thing. Finally, symptom checkers are really starting to have to show that they have a good basis. They're standing on solid ground. Wellness apps, the same way, right? If they're using some sort of wearable, if they're using some sort of data to make a recommendation to the user, they need to have clinical evidence, or they need to have evidence that the solution works. And then disease management apps, right? So that's where we see really the ventures ventures that are partnering with insurance companies. They really are requiring proof of solution, being required to show that their solution actually works.
Yeah, and of course, be fascinating to see this in the context of what the overall global digital ecosystem is doing, which is an interesting segue. Thanks, Sarah. I think that's probably where we'll round off for today. We really wanted to give you a quick flavor of what's in this report. As I said, 40 plus pages of data rather than advertising for you to really help get a better understanding as to how insurers are measuring up in digital health. And it's I would describe it personally as it's promising, but we're still, I think, a long way from where insurers should be in view of their current predicament, challenges, and the fact that consumer and patient expectations are evolving fast. You can certainly ask your questions through the Q&A, and as I said in the chat there, you can send us any other questions via the info@GalenGrowth email address.
If I may, Julian, I'm going to jump in and plug. If you're interested in clinical strength, I'm currently finishing up the report for the end of September, beginning of October, on entire report on clinical strength in digital health ventures. So I definitely invite you to check that out. Digs very deep into this topic and shows you what the global ecosystem is like for ventures that do have a strong clinical strength.
Absolutely. I'm very much looking forward to seeing the final analysis from you and the team, where we look at essentially all 12,000 plus digital ventures across the globe and get a really good understanding of where clinical evidence really is coming through. As we move away really from what I would describe as a period of FOMO to a period of fear of looking foolish. Previous reports as well worth mentioning. Certainly recommend June's report, which looked at the role of digital health in biopharma research. Very fast growing area, which is seeing a significant switch from investors into in the past few months. So I strongly recommend looking at that for those of you who are interested in what the drug research world is doing with digital health. And of course, our mid-year reports, which were launched or released in July, where we broke down the 5 key regional ecosystems of the world, but by key trends, similar to some of the ones you've seen today. So a very unique again, because most of the reports you've seen are either in global aggregate or have been US centric. So this is very unique again for you. As I said in my message to you all, the report, along with all of our reports, is powered by HealthTech Alpha, the world's leading digital health private market data intel insights platform, which you can use for yourself. You can have your own free of charge account, and you can navigate the world's digital health ecosystems free of charge by having your own account on HealthTech Alpha. So please feel free to go and do that. As I said, any final cues, visit us at galengrowth.com or send us an email at info@galengrowth.com. And so thank you very much, Sarah, for your gallop through this 40-page plus report and giving us a salient highlights. And I thank you all for joining us today. And with that, we shall close.